They're too much. I have so many questions.
I'm not sure where to start with the Saints Row Reboot, and I think that's because while I didn't have an outright negative experience with it, it's also just not a good game. For all the talk from Volition about using this reboot to move the franchise forward and into the future, I've never seen a game so remarkably fail to achieve what it set out to do, and in fact achieve the exact opposite by remaining so firmly rooted in the past. There was a real opportunity here for Volition to wipe the slate clean with Saints Row and reaffirm its identity as a game with modern mechanics and modern storytelling, and instead Volition failed to capitalize on that, with the result being a patchwork of mechanics that have been recycled from previous entries, and the only thing that really gets rebooted in this entry is the story. Now, I know this review is coming a little bit late, but I wanted to take my time with the Saints Row Reboot and try to play it as close to completion as I could so that I could give an honest and informed opinion. I think a lot of the reviews out there have been quick to jump to conclusions about the game and write it off as a completely broken and unplayable experience, and that's not necessarily the case. There is some fun to be had with this game. Unfortunately, a lot of it is really overshadowed by how unfinished the game feels. Visually speaking, Saints Row is nothing to write home about. That's not to say it's a bad-looking game, it just isn't anything special. It looks like a mid-PS4 era game, which is fine, but it really doesn't do anything to take advantage of newer hardware. Draw distances are ridiculously short even on the PS5, and vehicles and textures seemingly pop in and out at random, sometimes when they're mere feet in front of your character, and that can be a little bit annoying, especially knowing that modern hardware is capable of a lot more. One of the best things that this game has going for it is the open world map, and I appreciate that Volition took the risk of using a city inspired by the American Southwest that isn't LA or San Francisco. I feel like a lot of contemporary open world maps are set in LA or other parts of California, or some urban jungle environment like Chicago or New York, and it gets to be a little cliche, so this Nevada-inspired map with Latin American cultural influence was really refreshing. Santo Ileso is a beautiful looking city, and there's lots of cool and unique looking structures and architecture throughout the city, as well as a vast desert area surrounding the city for you to explore. There's plenty of collectibles to find, and they're at least somewhat functional in that each one you find unlocks a new prop for you to decorate your hideout with, although some of the descriptions for where to find the collectibles in the in-game collectibles app are actually incorrect and point you to the wrong region of the map, which led to me wandering around for hours in a frustrating wild goose chase. You'll also find wingsuit launch points scattered throughout the city, which give you an opportunity to launch up into the air and fly around. Unfortunately, I found that these were too few and far between to be useful, and so the wingsuit comes across as more of a gimmick that's really only useful during the wingsuit side missions than anything else. It doesn't really feel like it was made to be used as a primary mode of transportation, like in Just Cause 4 for example, which is unfortunate because there are some cool mechanics in this game that rely on the wingsuit, like bouncing from one car roof to another, or jumping off of pedestrians to relaunch yourself into the air, and there just really weren't enough opportunities to use those. While a lot of people might not be fans of the game's cartoony, Fortnite-esque visual style, I think the biggest problem with the game visually speaking was just how buggy the animations were. Whether you're doing one of the takedowns that you use to restore your health, or even during a cutscene, you'll often find that animations don't play out correctly, resulting in enemy characters T-posing or ragdolling around randomly, or even having your character's limbs contort and clip through their chest in weird ways that they shouldn't be able to, and it just makes the game feel like it was rushed. At the height of the game's climax, and one of the moments that was clearly supposed to be one of the most tension-filled moments of the entire story, broken animations took me completely out of the moment and ruined the immersion for me. Now, when talking about the gameplay in Saints Row, the first thing I have to mention are the bugs, because every aspect of this game is bugged in some way. I'm not exaggerating when I say that there are more easily replicable bugs in this game than any other game I've ever played in my life, and that includes Cyberpunk 2077. And I'm not going to make an exhaustive list of them here, because that would take way too long, and if they were all one-offs, I'd be a little more okay with it, but because these bugs were so persistent throughout my playthrough, it really hurt my experience. It really makes the game feel unfinished, and it makes me wonder why this game was delayed for 4 months, because it seems like Volition didn't playtest this game at all, or if they did, they finally just said fuck it and didn't care and decided to launch the game anyway, despite the fact that it was really, really broken. Aside from the open world map, the biggest positive I could pull out of Saints Row was the broad range of customization options that the player has at their disposal. From a gameplay perspective, everything from how much notoriety you gain for your actions to how bullet spongy enemies are can be adjusted, which pretty much gives you free rein to tailor the experience to your liking. I for one took advantage of this to make enemies less bullet spongy because I really didn't like that it took multiple headshots to take an enemy down. That said, even something as simple as adjusting the settings was a really buggy experience, and to give an example of that, when I went to turn on my DualSense adaptive triggers, every time I would toggle it on, it would actually invert my movement controls, and then when I went to uninvert the movement controls, that would turn the adaptive triggers off, which made absolutely no sense to me and got really annoying really quickly. Speaking of settings, if you've watched my gameplay videos for games like Watch Dogs Legion, you'll know that when I'm playing a PvE game, I like to turn the aim assist off and play with free aim, just because I don't want the game doing the work for me. Unfortunately, it doesn't really feel like that's a viable option in Saints Row because of how poor the aiming controls are. I spent a good chunk of time trying to tweak the sensitivity settings in Saints Row, and could never really find a sweet spot for my sensitivity. The speed that your reticle moves at changes constantly, which makes target tracking feel somewhat cumbersome, and really not as fun as it could be. Beyond the poorly implemented free aim controls, the combat just feels like it was pulled from a game from a bygone era. There's no cover system, and of course not every game needs to be a cover-based shooter, but I feel like something should have been done to modernize the combat and make it feel like a current generation game. The only thing this game really does to distinguish the combat from the original Saints Row's combat is to add abilities that you can unlock by doing challenges throughout the game. However, a lot of the abilities aren't really all that fun to use, and some of them are just straight up broken. There's one where you're supposed to be able to pull out a revolver and headshot 4 enemies in quick succession, and I found that that ability rarely, if ever, actually worked. So it was essentially useless throughout the entirety of my time playing this game. And I know it might feel like I'm ragging on Gunplay a little bit too much here, but the reality is that Gunplay is such a huge focus of the core gameplay loop in this game, and it's really unfortunate that it was implemented so poorly, especially considering that there's very little mission variety. A lot of the missions really just evolve into go here and shoot a bunch of people, and because combat feels so unsatisfying and dated, it really drags the experience down. That said, a lot of the side missions that do involve a heavy amount of shooting are pretty fun. For example, the wingsuit missions where you're flying from one building to the next taking out enemies feel pretty cool, and there are also some neat action set pieces involving a mechanic where you climb onto the roof of your car and shoot enemies while laying on your back on the roof, which I had a lot of fun with. Again, it's just unfortunate that the gunplay controls aren't a little more satisfying and a little snappier. The other big mechanic at the core of Saints Row is, of course, driving, which, like the gunplay, is not as satisfying as I would like it to be given how much of the core gameplay loop it makes up. For one thing, the turning could be a lot tighter. I found that with most vehicles, it was difficult to get around corners without slowing down to a near stop, or using the drift mechanic, so you really feel like you're forced to drift around every corner. Unfortunately, it felt like with some vehicles, it was a little too easy to overshoot the turn and drive off the side of the road. I found that the high-end supercars especially weren't as fun to drive as I thought they should have been. However, there's still some fun to be had with driving. Vehicle combat has a satisfying sense of impact when you go to sideswipe an enemy vehicle, and each vehicle has an unlockable signature ability which you can use to enhance your driving, like ejector seats, unlimited nitrous, the ability to jump your car. I was also pleasantly surprised to find that the tow truck missions were a lot of fun, where you drive around the city and pick up a random object to tow around and use it essentially as a wrecking ball to wreak havoc on enemy vehicles. Finally, although it's not as deep as a game like GTA 5, vehicle customization in Saints Row feels like there's enough variety that you can infuse any vehicle you have with your own personal style, which is always a plus in my book. Speaking of customization, I do have to give Volition props because the character customization in this game goes about as deep as any game I've ever seen. You have plenty of options to choose from for your character's build, voice, facial structure, skin tone, skin material. You can add prosthetic limbs, which I thought was a really inclusive choice. But there's really such a breadth of options that it really feels like you can create whoever you want to create. All it takes is one look at the in-game sharing app and some of the bosses that other players have uploaded to see just how deep this character creator goes. There are tons of insanely accurate recreations of characters like Shaggy, Walter White, Colossus from X-Men, Billie Eilish, and so many more that I couldn't help but be impressed by how creative the community is. While the clothing options do leave a little bit to be desired, you can change each individual article of clothing to be whatever color you want it to be, and there's enough of a selection of clothing items that you should be able to find something to suit your style. Where you don't have quite as much selection is with missions. Mission variety for the most part starts and stops with, go here and shoot these people. In one side mission, you're riding in the passenger seat of a vehicle and shooting people. In another, you're flying around on a wingsuit to different rooftops and shooting people. In another one, you're review bombing local spots and then shooting people. There isn't a whole lot of objective-based gameplay, so it can start to grow a bit monotonous. Fan favorite side activity insurance fraud sees a return in the Saints Row Reboot, but stiffer controls make this version feel a lot less fun than it did in Saints Row the Third and Saints Row 4.
I'm George, by the way.
You're an alright guy, George. When you wake up, you should stop by the church. The Saints could use a guy with some common sense. What do you think?
As I said before, a lot of this game feels like it's been recycled from Saints Row the Third and Saints Row 4, so the only thing that really feels like it got rebooted is the story. Unfortunately, the story that we got feels really underwritten and lazy, and really struggles to show us what it actually wants to be. And what I mean by that is that the game doesn't know whether it wants to be a PG action comedy or something a little more over the top and R-rated. Now, I was a fan of Saints Row 1 and 2. I really didn't like how over the top they went with Saints Row the Third and how much it sort of turned the Saints into corporate sellouts. I think Saints Row 2 really struck a good balance of having dark and serious moments and at the same time having a more lighthearted, satirical sense of humor. With the Saints Row Reboot, Volition clearly tried to dial things back so that tonally it fits somewhere between Saints Row 2 and Saints Row the Third, and unfortunately it never really quite manages to emulate either one of those games. And instead it loses sense of its identity and who its target audience is. In a lot of ways the game tries to be a lot more PG than past Saints Row entries. The name of the auto shop's been changed from Rim Jobs to Gym Robs. The fast food chain, which used to be called Freckle Bitches, is now just FBs. And your character, the boss, refers to Sergio, the boss of the Panteros gang, as a crap sack on multiple occasions. Like, are you kidding me? You swear all the time, and you're gonna go with crap sack to describe this guy? It really made no sense and felt jarring. There was such an inconsistency as far as whether this game wanted to be PG or not. And I know another one that disappointed a lot of people is that you can't run around and beat the living shit out of people with a 5-foot-long purple dildo. And yet at the same time, for the first time in this series' history, we've got uncensored topless female nudity, and we also have graphic violence. So the game really doesn't know what it wants to be and who it's for. But let's take a look at the plot and the substance of the story itself. Because one of the big knee-jerk reactions to the initial reveal trailer was that this game was giving off really hipstery vibes and that these characters weren't the Saints. Or at least they're not the Saints as we know and remember them. I wanted to go into the game with an open mind and see how these seemingly innocent Zoomer kids could go from being that to being hardened criminals. I thought that was the story we were going to be getting. But after having played through it, I feel like a lot of the initial reaction was, at least to some extent, justified. And a lot of that owes to the cast of characters, starting with the boss. From the outset, the boss comes across as this annoying, insubordinate douchebag who I personally could not stand to be in a room with for more than 5 minutes. And it's not like it's some underdog story about someone in a position where they're not getting the recognition they deserve and outperforming people's expectations of them. No, your character is this entitled, insubordinate fuck-up at the beginning and never grows beyond that to become anything resembling a leader of a criminal organization. And maybe it's the voice I chose for my character and the way the voice actor chose to portray them, but they never really feel like someone I could take seriously. In fact, as much as the initial reaction to the reveal of the supporting cast was largely negative, I feel like they are what really got me through this story. And that's not to say that they're great characters, because as much as they have varied and diverse backgrounds, most of their personalities can be boiled down to 2 or 3 traits. Kevin, for example, is a foodie who loves waffles and never wears a shirt. Eli is an awkward nerd who enjoys LARPing and is really into finance and won't shoot a gun. Nina loves cars and art, and that's it. The characters never grow beyond those traits. There are no character arcs, and what few moments they have that are supposed to feel emotionally weighty never feel earned. The big one that stands out to me is a scene where Nina's car is destroyed, and from the way the cutscene is animated, this is clearly supposed to be a devastating, soul-crushing moment for Nina that's supposed to feel like a part of her identity has just been destroyed. The problem is that up until that point, we have no idea how important that car is to her, or why it's that important. It's only ever explained in a brief dialogue exchange after the fact that really doesn't convey any sense of emotional weight or stakes. And that's the problem throughout this game. There just aren't any stakes for these characters. And so we're never given any reason to care about them, and nothing that happens to them ever feels earned. Their biggest concerns only ever seem to be maintaining their friendship and going out for karaoke night. And it's unfortunate because I think there was an opportunity there for some really good storytelling. For example, I was really interested to find out how Eli, who comes across as this innocent and awkward nerdy guy who's just really into LARPing, went from being someone like that to being a hardened criminal who has to turn to robbing people in order to pay back his student loans rather than just getting an honest job. He feels like someone who's smart enough that he could go far in a legitimate business, and yet he's decided anyway that the best way to make money is to start a criminal empire. So rather than emphasize character growth and development, the story instead focuses on the boss's struggle to establish the Saints as a quote-unquote legitimate criminal organization, which they do through setting up various businesses that are used as fronts for more illicit activities. It has a very Mafia-esque feel to it. It actually really reminds me of Mafia 3, and that's fine. The problem with it is the execution from a storytelling standpoint, and I could go through and talk about some of the underwritten missions that really don't have a whole lot of substance to them plot-wise, but what really stands out for me as an example of bad storytelling is a major plot point from later in the game. And I'm not trying to flaunt my law degree here or dig into the legality of this plot point, but anyway, late in the game, this lawyer comes to the Saints and presents them with the employment contract that the boss signed when they were working for Marshall. And in that employment agreement is a non-compete clause. And this lawyer tells the Saints that because of this non-compete clause, Marshall now owns the Saints. This is such a fucking stupid plot point. And again, putting the legality of the non-compete clause aside, in what fucking world are the Saints, who to this point have been beating people up, robbing people, scamming people, and murdering people, committing some of the worst criminal offenses possible, going to be worried about civil liability for breach of a non-compete clause in a contract? In what fucking world does that make sense? Up to this point, the Saints have not bowed to the authority of the law for any reason. And now all of a sudden it's a major plot point that there is a contract standing in their way? Are you fucking kidding me? I don't know how much research the writers did before they tried to shoehorn in this really, really dumb plot point, but it made me so goddamn angry. Now, I know that this game isn't really meant to be taken 100% seriously, but there is absolutely no way I could suspend disbelief to think that this would ever be a concern for the Saints. It was just such a dumb thing to include in this game, and if it were a minor plot point, I might be able to overlook it, but a huge chunk of this game is centered around this plot point, and it's just so unbelievably stupid. And not in the over-the-top fun way that Saints Row is all about, it's just plain stupid. Aside from some really dumb plot points, this game also has some of the most cringeworthy dialogue ever written, and Eli is responsible for a large chunk of that. Now, I know he's supposed to be this nerdy, awkward guy, but that's not an excuse for some of his lines. Some of them are just really badly written, others are just delivered really poorly. But the other big culprit is the boss. Now, there's one line I want to call out in particular, because this line is used so many times throughout this game, And it comes across not only as bad dialogue, but also lazy writing because of how much it's reused. And that line is, let's just go in and kill the shit out of everyone. Or some variation of that. At least 3 times in this game, maybe more, your character says that their plan for whatever they're doing is to go in and kill the shit out of everybody. And look, I know Saints Row is supposed to be a satire of other games in the open world genre and supposed to poke fun at them. And you could take this line in particular as poking fun at games where mission objectives often just devolve into going into a place and shooting everybody and then that's it. The problem is that kind of meta humor is only funny the first time. After that, it's no longer meta humor, it's just lazy writing. And again, it was used at least 3 times in this game. And the first time, okay, I got a chuckle out of it. The next 2 times, I couldn't help but roll my eyes. We get it. You're aware that most of these games just evolve into going into somewhere and shooting everybody. But being so on the nose about it and being so self-referential is only funny so many times. And that was a big problem with a lot of the dialogue in this game. They try to make jokes that just don't land, and so rather than coming across as funny, it really just feels cringeworthy. Now, that's not to say there aren't any funny jokes at all. There are some moments that I did get a good laugh out of. The problem is that those moments are generally overshadowed by bad writing.
We need a name.
The Saints. We call ourselves the Saints.
The Saints Row Reboot isn't a completely joyless experience. There are some genuinely fun moments scattered throughout, but unfortunately for every step this game tries to take forward, it seems to take 10 steps backwards. Every positive in the game, like the open world map design, the character creation and customization options, and the wide range of accessibility options, are overshadowed by poorly implemented gunplay controls, rampant bugs, and a lazily written and generally uninspired story. And taken together, all of those things make this game feel all too often like it's a game that was pulled out of a bygone era. If you're still on the fence about whether to buy Saints Row, I would say wait a few months for it to go on sale. Hopefully a bit of extra time will allow for Volition to polish the game up, and at least iron out some of the issues with the gameplay mechanics so that it feels a little bit more fun to play. But for now, I have to give the Saints Row Reboot a score of 4 out of 10.